Well, as we start every program at the Silversides, whether it be in person or, here we go, sorry, there we go. Whether it be in person or virtually, we started with the Pledge of Allegiance. So I ask everyone to please follow me as we start the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I will ask everyone now to mute themselves, or else I'll mute people as well if need be. But please mute yourself at this point.
Mute yourself. What?
It's a little button over on the side. If you move your screen up just a little bit, you'll see where the mute buttons are.
The lower left hand.
It looks like a little microphone.
Well, I want to believe you, but I see you're viewing Peggy Maniotta's screen. View options, series sponsor. Is there something
Yes, okay, well, you know what? I will just mute you, Don. Don, you are now muted. Okay. Our series sponsor tonight is the Lorraine F. Birch and the Fred S. Birch Jr. Foundation. They are a wonderful West Michigan couple that dedicated their lives to promoting service at the community, state, and federal level through education. It is the true ambition of the foundation that they will better our society through providing education that will encourage people to make their communities better as high as they possibly can go, whether it be at the local level or all the way at the state level. And that is their desire. And they are the primary supporters for our series. We also have a media sponsor. The media sponsor for our series is Blue Lake Public Radio. They do a phenomenal job in a very difficult time and to keep everyone informed and to tell them what is going on in the community. And we appreciate them completely for that. It is hard to imagine that we are here back in February. I think when we started last spring's series, which was completely on Vietnam, we had 10 lectures discussing all the different aspects, and we had arranged for the military historians from each of the different branches to come out. We had the woman that was a historian for the nurses in Vietnam, and we had several other programs where there were people that had personal experiences that wanted to talk about that. We got about as far as 3 lessons in to the series on Vietnam. And then the world changed and we had to stop. And that series has been rescheduled, of course, with some differences, because 2 of our speakers since the pandemic started have passed away. Neither one of them was from COVID, but they were from other illnesses that they were suffering from at that point. So our Vietnam series will be September of 2021. We are also working on a new series for the summer, and it's called Veterans Pure View. And it will be on Wednesdays at noontime, hopefully at the museum. And it'll deal with topics that are of interest to our veterans. We'll have topics such as TRICARE, how to have someone come and be a part of your burial service, how family members can get your DD-214, how you can learn about folds of honor. We have a whole series set up and we'll be very happy to have that. We are hoping that everyone will be in person for that point, but if not, we'll continue to do it via Zoom. The series, as it continues, the same link that you are using tonight will work for the next 9 more weeks. If you want to, we'll gladly send you a link every week, but it's exactly the same as the link that you are currently using. So you can just continue using that. You don't have to email Teresa every week for a link. And next week's lecture was going to be on From Tehran to Moscow to Kabul, 1979 to 1982. And it's so very true because during the 1970s, the last thing America really was thinking about was the outside world. We did, after we did so many conflicts across the world, we looked inward and we spent our time focusing on what was going on in our own society and making our own society better. And we didn't really pay attention at the local level in the average person's home. They certainly did at the federal level. They certainly did at the governmental level. But locally, we didn't pay a lot of attention to what was going on in the rest of the world. We were more interested in, gosh, the price of gas has gone up, or look at how much our society has changed, and so many other things. And we didn't really pay a lot of attention as a society to what was going on in the rest of the world. That's where this lecture comes in and is of so much interest to so many of us, because we have so many wonderful veterans that served in this period from Vietnam until the fall of the Berlin Wall, that served very honorably, were involved in very many hair-raising, scary, deadly situations, except we as a society don't know very much about it. And as all of you know, the mission of the USS Silversides is to honor our veterans. And we do that through education and preservation. I find that it's very hard for someone to understand and honor a veteran until they have that opportunity to find out what it is that that veteran did, or what that group of veterans did. And then they get that feeling that I understand now. Now I see, and that goes a long way into helping our mission of honoring our veterans. And everyone knows our educational programs for adults, but we also offer quite a few for children as well. And we find with our education programs for children that when they come out to the museum, oftentimes it's like, oh, we're going on a field trip to a museum. But then when you engage them in an educational activity, such as how to build a periscope, and you take them on that submarine, and they're like, well, when they're under the water, how do they see? Where's the windows? You mean they had to live down here? And suddenly it all comes together, and then they have an appreciation for what the veteran did. And that is everything that we are all about through our education programs for adults, which is a lecture series, and through our children's, which is our STEM classes. And I cannot ask any one of you not to recognize all the preservation work we do with our vessels, and continuing on with all of the artifacts inside the museum. So next week, I hope you join us using the same link as this week to see our next lecture. And then, I'm sorry, move my next slide forward. We have tonight's speaker, Dr. Fred Johnson. He is a wonderful speaker. He has been with us many times before in the past, and we enjoy his lectures greatly. And so without further ado, I will turn the screen over to Fred, and we'll allow him to take over. So if you'll just give me a moment here to do some housekeeping, and I'm going to allow my participant to screen share. And I will ask anyone that is not muted to please mute yourself. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box or hang on until the very end, and then we will answer those questions for you. Okay, thank you very much, Fred, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Peg, for that great introduction and that great overview of this series, what we're calling The Last Gatekeepers. And good evening to all of you scholars of the Silversides Museum audience. Thank you so much for joining us. Just as Peg indicated, we're going to be covering the area from the end of the Vietnam War up until the fall of the Berlin Wall, or the end of the Cold War. Before I say anything about the period from 1975 forward, let me just quickly mention that this is looked at, when I put this together, I look at it generationally. The end of the Cold War did not happen because of any one single generation or any one particular war, but we must pay special attention and give special credit to anyone who's a Korean War veteran, definitely anybody who's a Vietnam veteran, and then that generation that came after Vietnam, roughly from 1975 until 1989, 1990, when the Cold War finally ended. It took two major wars, Korea and Vietnam, and so many smaller confrontations in between. The Cold War was called the Cold War because unlike World War II, which was obviously a very hot war, the Cold War were many confrontations that happened around the world, that happened in the Western Hemisphere, on the African continent, in Asia, obviously, a spy war in Europe, and it was around the world, but all together combined, those three generations, the Korean War generation, the Vietnam generation, and then the generation after Vietnam, their collective efforts helped to bring peace to this world and end the Cold War. It leave America as the sole nation standing, as the beacon for liberty. So thank you, Korean War veterans who have joined us tonight. Thank you, Vietnam veterans who are joining us tonight. And thank you, veterans from after those two generations, because you all put together, you did us a great service. The title, as we're starting here, The Last Gatekeepers, Trapped in Vietnam Shadow from 1975 to 1978. And that period from 1975 to 1978, I keep it narrowed because, as you well know, it was still the Cold War. The Cold War starts just as the dust is settling and the smoke is clearing from World War II. There's a Cold War already underway. The great alliance of the Soviet Union, the United States, and Great Britain, you know, as they say, politics makes strange bedfellows. Who in 1939 could have envisioned that the world's largest communist power would find itself working closely together with the world's largest capitalist power, the United States, and the two of them working together with the world's largest colonial power, Great Britain. But a common necessity of need and a common enemy called Adolf Hitler, and also the Japanese militarists led by Hideki Tojo, gave those three unlikely partners all the room that they needed and all the reason that they needed to come together to defeat tyranny. And soon after that, I mean, quite literally, as the dust was settling and the smoke was clearing, the Cold War began. As you can see from this image here, the hammer and sickle showing the Soviet Union and the stars and stripes showing the United States. Not all the nations that were involved, but generally speaking, for the East, they were led by the Soviet Union, for the West, led by the United States. The first major conflict of the Cold War, as we have alluded to and as Peg pointed out, was the Korean conflict. This map you see here in 4 panels. On June 25th, 1950, North Korean forces invaded South Korea, catching the world, the United States, and of course, South Korea by surprise. It was the beginning of a multi-decade struggle to see which nation, North Korea, South Korea, North Korea and its Soviet backers, and it's also Chinese backers, or South Korea and its American allies and the NATO powers, which group of people, which nations, which coalitions would finally dominate. Early on, by September 1950, it looked as if the South Koreans were going to be pushed into the ocean. But back in Japan, nearby, General MacArthur, who was serving as the military governor of Japan, General MacArthur was ordered by President Harry Truman to stage a counterattack, and General MacArthur chose as his place for an amphibious landing Incheon. Now, I won't take the time tonight to go into all the details of this relative to Incheon because we want to get to Vietnam in that period afterward. But Incheon was one of the worst, was and is one of the worst ports in the world to stage an amphibious landing. The port entry was narrow, which means that you could be shot at very easily. The waves were unpredictable. The tide was unpredictable. The port facilities were underdeveloped. Everything that you could imagine to make Incheon a terrible choice for a landing operation, for an amphibious operation. General MacArthur's advisors tried to reason with him. They begged with him. They tried to get him to understand that. And MacArthur told them that the very reasons that made Incheon a terrible port was exactly why the North Koreans would never see them coming there, because they knew that too. When MacArthur landed there, when UN forces led by the United States landed at Incheon, it basically cut off the North Korean supply line, and they had to double back north very quickly towards the 38th parallel. Now, there are a lot of things that happen that began to look like America and the UN allies were going to have victory, quick victory in Korea. But as the war dragged on, as the war moved in and got closer to the Yalu River is that boundary line where the North Koreans and China share a boundary, share a border. The Chinese had sent word to American diplomats through back channels to an Indian diplomat that if the United States continued getting closer and closer to the Yalu River, the Chinese threatened to come in on the side of the North Koreans. American diplomats, and specifically General MacArthur, did not heed that warning very seriously. And the North Koreans were aided by China entering on their side. A ceasefire was finally agreed upon in 1953. That ceasefire has held since then. It's been very tenuous. It's been very shaky. At various times, it's almost broken down. But what that means then is that right now, as I speak to you, North Korea and South Korea, North Korea and the United States are still technically in a state of war because a ceasefire means exactly what it says. It is an agreement where two combatants agree to cease firing at each other. You do not have a peace treaty until you have a peace treaty. But here's the thing. Right as the North Koreans and the South Koreans and the United States were agreeing to their very tenuous ceasefire, America was already about to find itself in between a rock and a hard place in a place called Vietnam. They called it French Indochina at the time. It would end up being a cauldron. This map, this is a combat map, one of many combat maps you can find on the internet of Vietnam. But just take a look at some of the places where there were operations. The 17th parallel was the dividing line between North and South Vietnam, just like the 38th parallel separated North and South Korea. The 17th parallel separated the DMZ, the demilitarized zone in the north, from South Vietnam. You can see all the red flashes: Da Nang, Chu Lai, Quang Nai, Kon Tum, Pleiku, Nha Trang, Cam Ranh Bay, Bien Hoa, Saigon, My Lai, Can Tho, Cam Mau. All those names will become familiar to the generation of the late 50s into the 1960s up to the early 1970s. This country, this conflict would define an entire generation. Not just those who went to fight in Vietnam, but those who stayed behind and opposed the war. Many people that stayed behind to oppose the war saw themselves as doing their patriotic duty. The thing that we need to remember is that those young kids, and many of them who were drafted, because in the 1960s we had a draftee army. What we have now is an all volunteer force, what they call an AVF. We decided to have an all volunteer force because of the lessons we learned from having a draftee army. But we should never, ever lose sight of the fact that nobody actually was clamoring or dying to go to Vietnam. Millions, rather thousands of people were drafted. They went, they did their duty. Just like so many people went and fought in Korea, they did their duty. We need to honor those veterans every opportunity we get. Ho Chi Minh, the leader of the North Vietnamese, he had a long history. Ho Chi Minh, more than anything, was he a communist? Yes. Was he a Leninist? Yes. But what he was more than a communist and a Leninist, more than those two things, he was a nationalist. All of his life, from World War I all the way up to the time of his death, the one thing that he fought for, the one thing that he wanted, was a free and independent Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh fought against foreign occupation when it was the Chinese. He fought against the French who colonized Vietnam or Indochina. He fought against the Japanese during World War II when they took over from the French. After World War II and the French returned, he continued fighting against the French. When the French lost at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. In 1954, in one of the most important battles of the 20th century, that is what, I guess the best way to describe it is that It was definitely a game changer. The Vietnamese forces, supposedly outclassed by French superior firepower and technology, they absolutely crushed the French outpost at Dien Bien Phu. And the French exited in French Indochina. And then when they left, the United States stepped in eventually to fill the void. That was the beginning of the American, some people call it the American adventure, the American enterprise, the American stay in Vietnam. If you look at what Ho Chi Minh wrote, just these two quotes, it gives you an idea of the working of the man's mind. He said in December 19th, 1946, just a little while after World War II had ended, our resistance will be long and painful, but whatever the sacrifices, however long the struggle, we shall fight to the end until Vietnam is fully independent and reunified. And then consider this next one. You can kill 10 of my men for every one I kill of yours. But even at those odds, you will lose and I will win. If we take that statement, that second one that he sent to French colonials in 1946, what Ho Chi Minh was essentially saying, and it sounds brutal and it sounds ruthless, and you're right, it is brutal and it is ruthless. But Ho Chi Minh is basically putting people on notice saying, we're prepared to lose as many people for as long as it's necessary until we either bleed you out or we are independent. It's often said that a picture is worth 1,000 words. And this would be the case with the pictures you're now going to see, what I call faces from the storm. Keep in mind that these are young people, 18, 19, 20-year-olds, men and women, black and white. Most of them, the great majority of them, far away from home, doing a job that they didn't sign up to do, that they didn't want to do, but they went and did it anyway. Their faces tell the story of the storm far better than any commentary I could give. So just bear with me and take a look at these faces from the storm. Catherine Leroy was a combat photographer, one of the first, and one of a few female combat photographers near the front. You see several things in those pictures. First of all, you see people, young people, who are giving their youth, they're giving the best of their youth to the Vietnam War. Secondly, you saw helicopters. Helicopters, especially the UH-1H Huey helicopter. The Huey helicopter and the sound of the Huey helicopter came to symbolize the introduction, the advancement of technology, and the changing style of warfare, air cavalry, medevac, some of the stuff that we take for granted today, like life flights. When people get injured in an auto accident, they get life flighted to the hospital, triage on the battlefields, being able to save soldiers' lives, save limbs, and so on. All those kind of techniques, all those skills, sadly, tragically, people got good at saving lives in Vietnam, and they incorporated them into civilian medical practices. We also found out about something else in Vietnam. It's a holdover or something that people didn't really understand after World War I. After World War I or during World War I, it was found that men, sometimes who were not even near the battlefront, had strange nervous conditions, being emotionally exhausted. They were afraid. And in World War I, they called it shell shock. They didn't have the language for it because they didn't understand what it was all about at the time. They called it shell shock because they thought that the jangling of rolling bombardments, and in World War I, the world's first seriously industrial modern war, where they had barrages of artillery for hours and sometimes days at a time. Some doctors believe that it jangled the insides of soldiers and shocked them from the shells exploding all around them. So they called them shell shock. In World War II, they just called it combat fatigue. After Vietnam, they said it was post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. And now we realize that World War II veterans, Korean War veterans, veterans from Vietnam, veterans from Gulf War I, veterans from all of our wars, including the most recent wars, have the possibility, not absolutely, but there's always the possibility that the stress of being in an environment that's constantly hostile, where you might lose your life, and what you have to do and how you have to be on guard 24/7, that can cause various forms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And then another thing you saw in those pictures are the faces from the storm. Those of you who lived through the period know that the 1960s were not a calm period for the United States. There was tremendous clashes in the street, complaints about police brutality, complaints about hippies and draft dodgers and the civil rights movement. They were not peaceful times in the United States. But did you notice that on the battlefield of Vietnam, Black and white soldiers did not have time to engage in their cultural differences, because on the battlefields of Vietnam, just like on the battlefield of Korea, and where it was allowed on the battlefields of World War II, in the midst of combat, those soldiers, those sailors, those Marines, those airmen, those Coast Guardsmen, Black and white soldiers, they put aside their differences, because the only thing that really mattered, it wasn't so much their friends back home, but the guy in the foxhole beside them. As they say, that's where the rubber met the road, things got down to brass tacks. Those pictures tell a story of who we can be if we let ourselves be that way. Ho Chi Minh committed himself entirely to making his country independent. As you can see here, he also was quoted as saying, "It is better to sacrifice everything than to live in slavery." We understandably thought we were fighting a war against a communist aggressor, and Ho Chi Minh was a communist, and he was an aggressor, and he was backed by the Chinese and backed by the Soviet Union. Vietnam was what they called a proxy war. Since the Russians and the Americans could not fight each other, they fought each other through other countries, Korea in one instance, and Vietnam in another. It was deemed better to do it that way than to have a nuclear exchange called World War III. But toward the end, the venture in Vietnam in 1975 finally came to an end, and it came very dramatically. I have a couple of videos I'd like to share with you all.
lined up at installations around Saigon waiting for buses would be used. It told the Vietnamese that this was the end of the line. For most of those who wanted to leave their country, this would be their last chance. Some Americans who pushed towards the bus tried to pull their Vietnamese wives and children along with them. There were desperate scenes with families separated and crying out for help, pleading not to be left behind, clutching at the last straw of hope. We rode through the streets of Saigon for more than 4 hours, unable to find a way out or anyone who could tell us where to go. At Consulate Airport, armed paratroopers turned our buses back. At one point, we were unloaded on the Saigon waterfront, where we could see American helicopters circling the city, and Vietnamese trying to escape on boats heading to the sea. No one wanted to be left in this crowd that at times was strangely quiet, but that always was on the verge of panic. We all decided to try and reach the United States Embassy, and once there, we found it surrounded by Vietnamese looking for a way in and a way out. Helicopters were landing on the roof and inside the compound as we walked to the back of the embassy. We had to push and shove our way through a crowd of several hundred Vietnamese trying to scale the walls, only to be knocked back by U.S. Marines. Once inside the compound were the Americans and those Vietnamese who managed to get in with legal documents, and the many who managed entrance without. The rest was easy. It was just a matter of waiting your turn for a helicopter to take you to one of the ships on station off the Vietnamese coast. The American fleet had been having problems since the start of the evacuation, with the arrival of South Vietnamese pilots and their helicopters loaded with family and friends. Hovering above the decks to unload their passengers, the pilots were unfamiliar with landing their craft on a moving ship. The side of the USS Blue Ridge,
I do. Yes, well, you guys. I brought it home because I wasn't sure what I remember. Yeah, yeah, it's right here. These two types. Okay. Yeah, either one does have more of it. Yep. All right. So there's a USS Silversides in Muskegon. The museum, this Fred Johnson is hosting tonight at 7 a seminar on the New World Order. Oh, now that's been actually was clear back in Vietnam. They interfering with stuff, you know. Them anyway. He's a professor at.
And there's this one.
Would go to their homes, land right in their front yards, pick up their families and anybody else and head out to sea, hoping they can rendezvous with a ship. Well, we're one of the first ships they saw.
Our flight deck will only take one helicopter at a time landing. There were no wheels on them, you just had skids. We couldn't think of what else to do, and these other planes were looking for a place to land, so we just physically pushed them.
Of course, this was a big old helicopter, thousands of pounds, so we had to figure out how to get it 15 feet over to the edge of the flight deck.
You don't have time to think about what you did, you just had to do it. So we opened up our flight deck and they began to land, one right after the other. Some of them were shot at, holes in them.
Most of the Vietnamese who came out, I'm talking about the flight crews, they were heavily armed, all with sidearms, some with M16 rifles. They had no idea what was going to happen, so they came out ready for anything, really. So we had to disarm them.
None of them had ever landed on a ship before. They were Vietnamese Air Force. Everybody had a gun. We took all the guns away from them. And about 5 minutes later, another one came in and landed. And we pushed his airplane over the side. That was the second one. I helped push that one over too. Then the third plane came in. It landed also. We pushed it over the side. So meanwhile, we've thrown 3 helicopters in the water so far. This is incredible. I know you're probably not believing it, but it's all true.
If you can remember back then, I was just a kid when the Vietnam War ended. But I remember watching those scenes of helicopters being pushed into the ocean and the news commentators talking about the millions and billions of dollars just being left behind to the North Vietnamese communists. And then there was this infamous photograph right here of people on top of the embassy roof in Saigon trying to get aboard this one helicopter. And of course, it's not that one UH-1H Huey helicopter does not have enough room to take all those people. Now, it may be of interest for you all to know that at Hope College, my colleague, Dr. Scott Vanderstoep, and I, for the last 3-4 years, well, certainly not last year because of all this COVID coronavirus business, but up until then, we have been taking, every spring, we take students to Vietnam to get them in touch with not just the Vietnamese people and Vietnamese culture, but to bring them straight to where the Vietnam War was fought. We have taken them to My Lai. We have taken them to different battlefield sites. We've gone to North Vietnam. We've been to Dien Bien Phu. We've had them meet North Vietnamese Army veterans. So it's been very, very transformative. And while my hope is always that the students learn something, I got to tell you, I learned a lot too. There's nothing like, as those of you that have been in the military know, there's nothing like walking the ground of a battlefield to put you right there in the boots of the people that were there at the time when the thing was going on. And the last time we were there, we were looking for this particular building where this helicopter was, but they had changed the embassy around and this building is no longer there. But this scene, I remember seeing this scene on the front cover, the front page of the Washington Post, and this pretty much summed up the humiliation that America felt at the end of Vietnam. There it is, the New York Times. President Minh surrenders Viet Cong in Saigon, 1,000 Americans and 5,500 Vietnamese evacuated by copter to US aircraft carriers. If you look at the cover of Time magazine, how Time covered the progress of what was going on in Vietnam, take a look at this cover of Time magazine from March 24th, 1975. The war still being fought, but it's coming to a very rapid close. And then March 31st, 1975, a week later. And then April 14th, 1975, collapse. April 21st, 1975, last exit from Vietnam. And you can see on the front cover of Time magazine from that date, Gerald R. Ford. Because don't also forget that during the end of Vietnam, we also went through a crisis domestically called Watergate and a presidential resignation. This was a complex period, to say the least. President Ford took over from President Nixon after he resigned as a result of the Watergate scandal. And now you have this brand new president that has to figure out what to do as his country retreats, not slowly, but very rapidly from Vietnam. May 5th. By May 5th, it was over with. May 12th, the following week, Ho Chi Minh declared the victor on the cover of Time magazine. And the United States was shaken. For the next few years, the United States in its foreign policy will be kind of like a wanderer in the desert, trying to find its way. Its footprints being washed away or blown away by the sand or the wind, and trying to find its confidence, doing an autopsy on the military, looking at what happened, going through a rearrangement of the force structure, the command, relationships, everything. The proud American eagle that went into Vietnam left looking more like this. And those warriors that went to Vietnam and never returned. In Norse mythology, when warriors die, they go to a place called Valhalla, the Hall of the Warriors, where they're celebrated for all eternity. Is there a way to honor? Well, most Americans are not believers in Norse mythology, but we have our own way of honoring them. And sometime after the Vietnam War ended, an appropriate monument was decided upon and built in Washington, D.C. that has engraved into it, etched into it, the names of each one of the 58,000 who were lost. On any given day, you can see people at the Vietnam Memorial Wall with a piece of paper and maybe a marker or a pencil, and they're scribbling on the paper to etch the name of a loved one or a friend. People come here, they look for that name, they stand there, they pray, they reflect, they remember. You Vietnam veterans will remember these jungle boots. I remember these boots from my father having them. My father was 20 years Air Force, and I always thought that these boots were just kind of odd, but these are the boots that he wore. The green on the side, supposedly the design was to allow your feet to breathe. This was a standard issue for Vietnam. For those in Vietnam, and again, the memories of service, the memories of loss, the memories of what they went through, the memories of youth lost. And this one right here, this one never ceases. Every time I see this picture, it moves me so. Because here's a guy who knows that he gave the best years of his life to a cause called Vietnam. And he got so close to friends of his that are gone in that wall, he'll never see them again, and they are reaching back to him from eternity. Friendship across time. And then after the loss of Vietnam, the humiliation of Vietnam, there was a legacy of Vietnam. The legacy of Vietnam, which includes, among other things, as I tell my students in the US military class at Hope College, I tell my students that the reason why we rightfully today pay so much respect to our troops, men and women in uniform, and we say thank you for your service is because we as a nation failed to say thank you to people who served in Vietnam when they came back from Vietnam. Our Vietnam veterans, and quite frankly, our Korean War veterans did not get the kind of hero's welcome that they deserve to get, unlike the people that came back from World War II. World War II, some historians have said that World War II was the last good war. You could definitely identify the enemy. They were the Nazis, they were the Japanese, they were in uniform. You didn't have to worry about trying to figure out who was civilian and who was a combatant. Everything was pretty much not completely known, but it seemed to be more simplified. Vietnam and Korea were wars of ideology. They were unpopular wars. There were wars that the country didn't want to necessarily go fight. There were foreign policy wars that were difficult to understand. And so as a result, our veterans from Korea, especially Vietnam, came back to either a muted welcome, a silent welcome, or a hostile welcome. Like somehow young people set to fight a war, it's their fault for going to do their duty. Well, we try to compensate for that today as part of the legacy of Vietnam. But there's more than just that legacy. If you look at this political cartoon, it shows Lyndon Johnson. The caption reads, "My power is gone, can't move. That strange metal has sapped my super strength. I can't even get to a phone." The thing that killed Lyndon Johnson's presidency was a place called Vietnam. This one still struggling to find meaning to it many years later on the 40th anniversary, Vietnam. Once we went into the Iraq War, people began making comparisons to Vietnam. The longer we stayed in Iraq, like this political cartoon shows, is it Vietnam yet? Is it Vietnam yet? The little kids keep asking. Vietnam cast a shadow over Gerald Ford. It cast a shadow over Bill Clinton. It cast a shadow over George W. Bush. It cast a shadow over Barack Obama. Every president since Vietnam has had to live with a legacy of foreign involvements that many people begin to suspect might become quagmires like Vietnam. So at the end of the Vietnam War, as 1975 turned into 1976, America, for many people in the foreign policy community, for many people around the world, America was still the leader of the free world. America was still the leader of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The Cold War was still going on, but America had taken a serious blow, gotten a real big black eye as a result of Vietnam. By the time you get to 1980, here were the Cold War spheres of influence. You see in the blue, all the nations that were aligned with the United States. If you take a look at the red, look at the red. There's all of the Soviet Union, most, if not all of Eastern Europe, and a good chunk of Africa, and some parts of South America, and of course, Cuba. The Cold War was not over by any stretch of the imagination. This is another map that gives us a similar view, but maybe a little more accurate, so you can see just the extent of communist influence. And Vietnam, Laos are definitely colored in the communist colors. Africa became another battlefield where East and West met in different times in different countries, in Sudan, in Eritrea, in Ethiopia, in Somalia. The world was a battlefield. And as the United States struggled to find its footing again, to reorient its policy, to put Vietnam in its rearview mirror, as America struggled to find its confidence again, to establish a new foreign policy priority. Before it could do all of that, a few other things had to be set straight first. First things first. Before we got out of Vietnam, the war was expanded into Cambodia in a secret war that was launched by President Richard Nixon. On April 30th, 1970, he went before the country to announce that as part of the Vietnam War, part of his strategy for fighting the Vietnam War, the war had been expanded into Cambodia, and once he announced it, of course, there was too late to do anything about it. It turned out that Nixon had been bombing Cambodia, apparently, allegedly, because the Vietnamese were using Cambodian supply routes to help supply their war effort. Well, from a military standpoint, you could probably understand that, but what that did was it fueled more anti-war sentiment at home. It expanded the war, the range of the war, but what it really did was that it unleashed a wave of instability in Cambodia, in Phnom Penh, the capital city, and Cambodia was already not that most stable country in the area anyway. In 1975, after the Americans pulled out of Vietnam, the expansion of the war into Cambodia produced a civil war where those individuals that you saw on the previous slide, they were called the Khmer Rouge. The Khmer Rouge were led by a bloodthirsty madman named Pol Pot. His given Cambodian name was Saloth Sar, but Pol Pot will become a name that the entire world would soon know because of something called the Cambodian killing fields, where Pol Pot would empty out all the major cities of Cambodia, especially the capital city of Phnom Penh, drive people into the countryside. Anybody who wore glasses, anybody who knew how to read, anybody who was a journalist, anybody who was a teacher, anybody who was a doctor, dentist, anybody who had any kind of intellectual ability, anybody who was deemed as being smart, anybody who was deemed as being literate or educated, he killed them first. And over the next few years, up until 1977, this man waged a one-man war on his own people, killing millions of Cambodians. But in 1975, as America is still trying to pull back from Vietnam, an American supply ship named the SS Mayaguez was taken over by Cambodian pirates. This, post-Vietnam, was President Ford's first big test. As you can see here from the Stars and Stripes magazine, ship attacked, seized by Cambodian pirates. And an unarmed American merchant vessel reported Monday it had been seized under fire by a Cambodian naval vessel. President Ford termed it an act of piracy and warned of serious consequences. And President Ford, to his credit, took action. The Marines were sent. Actually, it was a multi-service force of Marines. And on May 26, 1975, as you can see from this Newsweek cover, a raid was launched to rescue the crew of the Mayaguez. Most of the time when I mention Mayaguez in a U.S. military class, my students had never even heard of this. A lot of people have forgotten about the Mayaguez, but this was a major turning point in American foreign policy. This did not change the defeat in Vietnam. It did not mean that America was going to regain its strength, but what it did mean, even though this particular rescue operation didn't go as well as planned, there was a lot of confusion, as any rescue attempt, as any commando operation is going to have. Mistakes were made. But the virtue of this lies in the fact that President Ford took decisive action to get our ship back. In the process, 3 U.S. Marines, Gary L. Hall, Danny G. Marshall, and Joseph N. Hargrove lost their lives. 3 more added to the thousands who'd already been lost in Southeast Asia. It was the beginning of a turnaround for American foreign policy. I call this series The Last Gatekeepers. That generation of airmen, soldiers, sailors, Marines, Coast Guardsmen, all the branches of the service, men and women in uniform, civilian staff at the Pentagon, Department of Defense, everybody's part of our defense structure. Like the 3-headed mythical dog Cerberus in Greek mythology, who guarded the gates of hell to keep out the people who were unwanted and to protect those who were behind those gates. Those gatekeepers stood watch. And from 1975, that last generation, the ones who would take the baton from the Vietnam generation, just like the Vietnam generation had taken the baton from the Korean War generation, and the Korean War veterans who took the baton from those from World War II, although many of those who served in World War II went on to fight in Korea. That generation from 1975 to 1990, they would be the ones who would stand watch. They would be the ones who would get blown up in Lebanon in the 1980s when that truck bomb blew up that airport in Beirut. They would be the ones who would have to fight Muammar Gaddafi when he bombed that nightclub in Frankfurt, Germany. They would be the ones who will be sent to Lebanon time and time again. They would be the ones who would have to try and rescue American hostages in 1979 when the Iranians they started calling America the Great Satan. That generation, they don't have a war called Vietnam, they don't have a war called Korea, but they have conflicts that they are called upon to respond to keep this nation safe. keep American priorities front and center. They helped to reshape American foreign policy. Good leadership brought the Americans back to the forefront of being a leader of the free world. Over time, we came to apologize to our Vietnam veterans and to give them a very belated thank you. We still haven't said thank you enough. But this last gatekeepers, this generation, they would go on to do their part, adding to the work done by the Vietnam generation, adding to the work done by the Korean War generation, adding to those people from the early Cold War who were so instrumental during the Berlin airlift and standing up against the Soviets. All those generations combined will produce a victory called freedom at the end of the Cold War in 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, which was the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union and the end of communism. Not over the world, but at least that phase of communism in the 20th century. I wanted to share this with you all tonight to give you an overview of where we're going. I look forward to being with you for the next few weeks, and I will now take your questions.
Please feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question and let us know, and we'll answer your questions as the best we can. Fred, that was another masterful presentation. And every time I hear a new presentation on Vietnam, it just gives me more and more respect for the gentlemen and the ladies that served and how difficult it was. And not only how difficult their service was, but how difficult it was to come home.
Right. And you know what, Peg, every time I give a presentation or hear a presentation on Vietnam, I'm reminded, and yeah, this, as I mentioned it several times during the presentation, this goes for our Korean War veterans too, that we still owe them so much. We can't do enough for our Vietnam and Korean War veterans.
No, we cannot. Do we have anyone that has a question? Kurt, go ahead.
Hi, Fred. Good to see you as always. Love hearing from you. I really appreciated the photojournalist you talked about, Kathleen Leroy.
Right.
I know she was a French woman. Was she also embedded with American troops? Did she follow American forces?
Yes, she did.
And what was her, I know this, just a sentence about her. So what was her contributions? Did she have, was it Life magazine? Did she have full articles? What were her results, I guess?
You know, I do not know. I gotta go back and look into that. I just know that, I just know that as far as women photojournalists, not just photojournalists, but combat photographers.
Yeah.
She broke ground. She wasn't the only one, but she definitely was one of the women who, just as you said, the term we give it today, she was embedded with troops. So she was embedded with troops. So she was able to get a lot of photographs that otherwise wouldn't have been had she not been out there in the bush with the troops. So it's just an amazing young lady.
At a time that we did not have female American troops in combat.
Right.
Females.
You saw some of those pictures of, in trying to find women, pictures of women in combat during the Vietnam War, it's kind of tough. Now you find them as nurses and, maybe a doctor here or there, but they're still pretty much in the, well, how do you say it? The more, what somebody might call the more traditional roles that women were confined to. But Kathleen Leroy, she broke that, well, either broke ground or broke a glass ceiling. And it's just appropriate, like Peg alluded to include women in this roll call of people who are in Vietnam, because after all, soldiers get hurt and they gotta be put on the men. And women did a tremendous job. You remember that, some of you all might remember a show that was about the Vietnam War that came on, I think it was the 1980s, it was called China Beach.
Yeah.
And it talked about the contributions of women in Vietnam. And I was so glad to see that show. But even more than that, Kurt, there's a statue that's dedicated to women in Vietnam. There's a statue that's dedicated to women in Vietnam, and it shows a nurse looking up at a helicopter, and another nurse is holding a soldier, and you can see one nurse is looking out, look like she's looking for an enemy. So 3 nurses, one holding a soldier, one looking up at a helicopter, which you think is a helicopter for a medevac, and another one who's just looking at the bush to keep the other one safe. It's a very, very moving statue.
Well, thank you for sharing this little story of something important.
You're welcome.
And last spring, we actually had the historian for the nurses in Vietnam coming out to the museum. I'm hoping that we'll be able to get her back again when we do our series in the fall, which will just focus all 10 weeks on Vietnam. And
So I'm gonna find that statue real quick, Peg.
okay. Are you still able to share your screen, or do I need to go back and let you share
I
again?
think I can. Let me just.
Okay. So while we're waiting for Fred to find the picture of the statue, the memorial to the nurses, do we have any other questions that we can answer? And any questions about the rest of the series and what's coming up? Next week, we're going to be moving into unknown territory for us. We have not talked about the Middle East at all since we did the lecture series several years ago, War's End, Roadmap to the Future, and where we touched on the end of the Ottoman Empire and this is dissolving, which caused a lot of the conflicts that we're currently involved in. And we touched on it briefly when we've done World War II histories, but we'll be moving back to that, and it'll be very different because it's not something we generally talk about, even though now is primarily where our soldiers are stationed.
Right. Do you see it? You see the statue?
I can see the statue, yes.
Okay. So you see there's one nurse, she's looking up, and in your imagination, at least I imagine her looking at a helicopter. There's another one holding the soldier. And it's just a very poignant statue. I will stop my screen share. But you're right, Peg. After Vietnam, you figure that after Vietnam, President Ford runs for office in 1976. He loses to Jimmy Carter, and Jimmy Carter has a tremendous. Jimmy Carter's foreign policy, like his presidency, like a lot of presidents, is getting reevaluated now. And Jimmy Carter has some foreign policy successes, the Camp David Accords. He got Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat to sit down and sign a peace agreement that nobody ever thought that would ever happen. That the Egyptians and the Israelis would ever sign a peace agreement. And of course, Anwar Sadat lost his life because of that, because some people just didn't want the Israelis and the Arabs to be at peace with each other. And the shift in the Middle East, and then eventually what happened in 1979, when the Iranians stormed the American embassy and President Carter tries to get the hostages back, and there's a failure at Desert Warren, America is slowly pulled toward Central Asia and the Middle East. And by the time you get to Reagan's years, we are firmly located there, not just because of our alliance with Israel, but because it is such a volatile, unstable place. And our dependence upon oil, especially from Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, demands that we're there to protect the Straits of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf.
Very much so. I also think that post-Vietnam, we become involved in more and more NATO operations under the guidance of the United Nations.
That's right.
And it takes our soldiers far and wide, and it really changes their trajectory. And that is sometimes why I think that we don't know as much about what we had our enlisted men and women doing at that point, is because it wasn't an American action. It wasn't an American conflict. It was part of the worldwide conflict.
Right. And
trying to keep peace across the board.
And we also began expanding NATO further east toward Russia. In the 1940s and 50s, the 1955 was when the Warsaw Pact finally comes together in response to NATO in 1949. But the Russians, understandably, legitimately, the Russians are paranoid about their borders. They were invaded by the Swiss, they were invaded by the French, they were invaded twice by the Germans. So yeah, they're probably a little bit paranoid. But after the Soviet Union falls and NATO countries begin expanding eventually into Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, then Poland, the Russians, what eventually happens with the Russians, especially as Vladimir Putin rises to power, they began getting aggressive again. That's part of the reason why they're in Crimea and Ukraine today. So there's all this stuff that's going on as America redirects its foreign policy that's having a direct impact on what's happening right now as we're trying to work our way through what's been going on domestically for the last few years.
Do we have any other questions for our speaker this evening? If not, I'd like to
If I
thank
may.
Fred. Oh, go ahead.
Fred, I've heard rumors that you might be on sabbatical. Are you doing some research that you could share with us?
Yes, Kurt, I am on sabbatical. I'm writing a book on Robert E. Lee's war against the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. I'm taking my dissertation, that 394-page monster, and scaling it down to basically looking at Robert E. Lee. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad was the longest east-west trunk line that the North had during the Civil War. It was well over 300 miles from Baltimore all the way to the Ohio River, terminating at Wheeling, West Virginia, or Virginia at the time, and then further south toward, I can't remember the name of the town, but either way, well over 300 miles. And Robert E. Lee, early in the war, told a subordinate commander, Colonel Robert S. Garnett, that if you could destroy that railroad at Cheat Mountain, it would be worth to us an army. Now, for Lee to say that, for Robert E. Lee to say that, because from the very beginning of the Civil War, Robert E. Lee and the South, they were always short on manpower, horse flesh, everything. So for him to say that destroying that one railroad will be worth an army, coming from somebody like Lee, that meant something. And when he went north the first time and it ended at Antietam, the second time ended at Gettysburg, or when he sent Juba Early north in 1864 to harass Washington, he always had, as part of his battle plans, attacking the B&O Railroad. So that's what I'm writing about.
Oh, thank you.
Sure. And yes, sabbatical feels great.
You've earned it.
Well, thank you very much. And we're so glad that you're on sabbatical because you have time to put together some of these wonderful presentations.
Yes, it's great being
Now,
here.
next week, we look forward to having you all here again. If you like what you see today, please consider supporting the museum by taking out a membership or volunteering with us. And tell your friends about it. There can be no higher compliment than you bringing a friend to one of these lectures. Because as I said, the biggest thing that the museum does is to serve its mission. And its mission is to honor veterans. And how better to honor a veteran is to understand their service. And so thank you everyone for coming this evening. We look forward to seeing you next week and the week after. The link will be exactly the same. So if you have this link, you don't need to email Teresa to get another one.
Okay.
But please feel free to share that link. And we appreciate having you all, and we'll see you again soon.
Good evening,
Good night.
scholars of Silverside. Good evening. See you next week.
Thank you, Fred.
See ya.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Fred.
Bye-bye.